Well, welcome everyone. It is, well, I would like to see, it's great to see you all, but actually I can't see or hear anyone, which makes this whole process slightly strange. So bear with us, but I'm sure we will have a very interesting discussion. I mean, I'm not surprised that so many people signed up to this topic, because I think as urban designers, we observe and analyze our environment and how the people move within it. And I think in the recent weeks, we have seen something where people's behavior has changed radically, had to change radically, but our environment has stayed the same. And I think that has really kind of, for myself, and I assume for many of you, kind of triggered some thoughts and reflection, as well as critical thinking about what this environment that we are now using, some elements we are using much more than before, and other elements we are actually not using a lot at all. So I think all of us are probably kind of thinking and assessing this new world we are living in at the moment. But I think it's not just our profession. It's also for a lot of people who have maybe never really engaged with the built environment consciously are now starting to think. They might think about where the nearest park is, where the nearest green space is, how they can walk or cycle to places. They might find that the streets have become much more friendly and try out cycling, and that we can hear bird songs and breathe fresher air. But they might also think that their own homes, the homes they live in, are not appropriate because they're too small for their whole family to be locked in together, or they haven't got any outdoor space they can escape to. So I think it's not just us who are actually critically thinking. It's probably a very high percentage of the population, and we can see it in the news as well. I mean, there was the article in The Guardian about Milan, how they are trying to kind of reclaim some of the streets in the future. So I think there's a lot of interest in how we can use this pandemic in a positive way to kind of move forward to a more positive environment. And I think within the UDG, and I assume you all agree, we are trying to find ways of how we can utilize this energy and this thinking to kind of make some significant changes and avoid that we are all going back to normal afterwards. And I think Roger really has kind of put together a really good think piece, and I think he really should start off the discussion with his thoughts, and which some of you might have read already, but I think it sets a really good framework for the discussion kind of coming forward. So I would like to hand over to Roger, who doesn't need any introduction. He has been kind of, a leading urban designer for many, many years. So Roger, let's hear from you.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I wanted to talk about what might be a better future for planning than we've had over the last few decades. And so I'm going to talk about land use, first of all. The pandemic provides us with time to reflect on the kind of world we've been building. Do we continue to treat the planet and its resources as commodities to be traded for our own wealth, or do we re-emerge after this crisis with a different set of priorities? Will we take the short-term fixes for ourselves or leave something of value to future generations? For urban designers, there's long been a gap between what we value and very often what we build. The growth of our towns and cities since the mid-20th century has been a byproduct of land use planning, whereby speculators in land bid for the right to sell that land on to single-use developers, estate by estate. So how might things be different when we step back after the lockdown? For most, the current changes to our lives are spatial. We stay home and away from colleagues. Will we revert to the same spatial patterns as before? Or might we re-emerge accompanied by a reawakening to build the kind of towns and cities that we value? So, some observations from me, first of all, on land use. Number one, retail. Shops and shopping centres are closed while online retail booms at the moment. The viability of high streets has been precarious for many years, but the current emergence from this lockdown will force lasting change. Town centres used to be about living, working, making, and trading at higher densities where proximity facilitated human encounter. Policies to turn such high-density, mixed-use areas into retail by moving out housing production and services to estates on the periphery over the last 50 years has made town centres vulnerable. We have built out of town shopping centres and then sought to turn towns into the same. Now we must revert to mixed-use town centres which offer more than simply retail zones A and B. Secondly, offices. The office is also a relatively recent innovation. One of the first purpose-built offices was completed in 1729 to house the East India Company in Leadenhall Street. For most businesses, however, the townhouse provided ideal accommodation and is still good enough for the Prime Minister, and indeed all of us at the moment. With everyone who can working from home, will we ever flock back to offices when we can work from home or out of a cafe? Third, housing. Much new residential will move back into towns. New housing will also need to have higher space standards than today if they are to be used as our offices and workshops as well as homes. Housing in the UK has the meanest space standards in Europe, and if that building stock is to serve us in the future, it must be more flexible. Miserly space standards build in obsolescence. Long life, loose fit must be the mantra. Fourth, movement. We are finding other ways to work and engage rather than travelling around. Nothing new, perhaps, but the enforced use of the internet rather than old-fashioned heavy infrastructure means that few will choose to go back to the daily commute. It places a question mark over planned road building projects and offers hope that the trend in urban areas to convert streets into roads, placing cars above pedestrians, can be reversed. Fifth, the public realm. You don't know what you have till it's gone, or forbidden for the present. The public realm of streets and squares is our common ground in both the geographic and spiritual sense. That facilitates society. It has been eroded outside of conservation areas, while it is difficult to think of a new high street or major avenue that can compare to those we have been gifted by earlier generations. The creation of a meaningful and memorable public realm must again be at the centre of planning, not an afterthought. Six, parks, urban parks, as distinct from the 40% green infrastructure that accompanies new strategic housing sites and is usually comprised by the bits that are difficult to build on, are valued the more when their use is restricted. Landowners don't compete to build parks, so that is the job of planning. So against all this hugely increased need for flexibility, what of land use planning? Well, I'd suggest that land use planning is dead. There is no longer much point in zoning land for different uses. A local plan which is based on fixing land uses in different locations is no longer relevant in this new age of mixed and flexible use. A new kind of local development plan is needed, which focuses upon movement structures and the public realm. Instead of making plans around land use and leaving the movement between sites down to off-site requirements, the new plans would set out the major streets in a collaboration between urban design and engineering informed by topography and microclimate. Plans would also incorporate new parks. There would be no land use zoning. Different uses would simply gravitate to those parts of the structure best suited to their function. For example, uses needing high footfall would relocate to the best connected streets, and those requiring tranquility to the least well-connected streets. Such changes would need resources to be moved from development control to actual planning, putting the planning back into planning. The proposed new street structures would need to service sufficient land for development needs. Street design would also need to include simple design codes for building frontages. Developers would bid for the right to build out each part of the plan, and planning authorities would need the characteristics and capabilities of a joint venture company in order to coordinate delivery. We would be bequeathing future generations urban form and the public realm to cherish, while allowing those who come after us to colour their use maps according to the needs of their age. Perhaps we should have been doing that all along. Thanks for listening. Over to Katja.
Thank you very much, Roger. I think that is a very good introduction to this discussion, and a lot of really, well, challenging thoughts. And I think to give it over to the audience, really, and just as a reminder, we have a chat function on this session. So if you have any comments, feel free to type them in there, and so everybody sees it. And we are also recording all the comments. If you have a question or a challenge to this audience, do raise your hand by pressing the button, and then we will know that you want to speak. I think I kick off with two questions that we had earlier, and they are related, and it relates obviously also to Roger's talk, and that is about how do we plan, and it's about the scale we plan at, because at the moment there is an increased focus and dependency on the locality. These are two comments I'm waving into one from Liz and one from Colin. And should we be designing or redesigning places so that they only rely on walking and cycling? Should that be the scale at which we are thinking of? And as Roger said, kind of integrate all the different uses within that zone, within that neighborhood. A kind of development form that to a certain extent we see traditionally in London with all its little villages. Is that something we need to push forward to? And then another comment from Liz, which is, I think, very important. How can we get recognition of the urgency with government? Because lots of statistics in the past have shown that I think 60% of people go back to normal really quickly after kind of, well, quite a dramatic change as we have just seen. So how can we kind of get that urgency across? And at this point, I want to hand over to you, and hopefully somebody will pick up the talk. No? Anyone being, oh, Robert? No? And everybody being shy?
Katja?
Yeah. Roger.
I think did that question come from, was it somebody from Holland? Was it?
No, both placed in this country.
Okay, I misunderstood the point. But I think it's worth saying that the system in England is very different to what happens on the continent, and continental countries are far more used to having what we call an urban design framework. They're rather baffled when we complain that we have very little control on what developers do further down the line, and they seem a little bit baffled like this. So the English system is really quite peculiar and seems to have developed in a way to accommodate business interests almost, and then try and grab a little bit of planning gain back through a Section 106 agreement. So I think really what I said in my essay piece was no more than what urban designers have been saying for a long time, is that we should be a lot more ambitious and creative in our thinking from the outset. We should be setting out framework plans with full consultation with local communities, and then expecting developers to work along those guidelines. I
totally, absolutely agree with you. Yes, we need to raise our ambitions.
The question might be, how do we make the transition from where we are now to what Roger suggests? How would you make the transition? Because to bring in regulations that just made the change straight out might be a bit. You might need to have some kind of like transitionary sort of arrangement so that you can develop. Like, would you have pilot projects, or how would you implement the new ideas, the methodology?
Yeah, I think that is a comment that relates to something that Paul has written. That, I mean, at the moment, we need to make sure we are not designing for isolation, and we need to design to kind of for places that are flexible going forward, because the world will probably most likely change again, and we might have another pandemic or whoever. So the places do need to be flexible and robust that we are kind of designing going forward. I had another comment in the chat, and as Politis, not quite sure who that is, and that's they're setting a challenge. So why are we just talking about cycling and walking? How about more cars and public transport? Does anyone want to come back to that challenge? Why are we focusing on walking and cycling?
I think I'd see if I can help with that. I think actually we're starting from the wrong starting point. We should remember that we are not designing towns and cities. It is largely the government's framework we operate in. And the government's framework, the way they will understand this, is that people need to socially isolate. So they need to drive and they need to live in suburbia. Where I think urban design can really help is actually we need to focus on the health benefits and use urban design to emphasize that. So in particular, we need to emphasize, yes, walking, cycling, access to local parks, access to local shops, and the air quality link between lots of driving and COVID, which I think is a strong argument we need to use. But I think we shouldn't fall into the trap of automatically assuming that everyone's going to think like urban designers and enable us to come forward with perfect land use plans. We're going to have to set out our stall very clearly with very clear arguments against established ideas in government. I think in particular funding is going to be a massive issue. Where is the money going to come for any of this? It's not going to come for long-term projects of rail and stuff like that. So the government will fall into its usual trap of road building, and which also generates revenue for them as well. So I think it's helpful to step back a bit first, so that we could then get to the urban design qualities we want to see delivered and built. I'll shut up now.
Thanks, Tim. Is there anyone want to kind of take up? I can see Colin.
How does that fit with what Roger's talking about? It still implies some kind of transition that's necessary, doesn't it? Is there going to be a regulation, or do we have to have a better idea of what it is that we're going for? Not new towns, town extensions. I'm not quite sure I understand what the core of Roger's idea is in relation to towns. How does he see his ideas developing?
Roger, do you want to come back to that? How can you explain how you can see your ideas developing, and how can we change what we are doing at the moment? Maybe in relation to how it is, explaining how it is done kind of in Europe.
Well, the way our local planning system tends to work in England is that there's a call for sites. Landowners come forward through their agents with sites they want to promote. They submit an OS map with a red line around the site, and then they argue why their site should be included in the local plan. And the assessment exercise tends to be an appraisal of each site. So we end up with fragmented sites, and not always a very coherent plan. We made this point from the Urban Design Group to government when the NPPF was last being reviewed. And the argument came back, well, there's no reason why local authority can't do that now. But what we asked for, could it be made mandatory? So the Colin's point about a transition, it's perfectly possible for local authorities here to decide to do things a little bit differently without falling foul of the planning system.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I've just seen a note from Liz, I think Liz from Line Planning, saying, well, yeah, she agrees to the proposition, but how can we move forward without throwing out everything that we have at the moment? How can we make a transition? And I think that transition is probably needed quite urgently or quickly, without having to redesign the whole planning system again, which in the past hasn't been that successful. Are they? Yeah.
Well,
can you hear me? Sorry, I was going to say that the government's pressing for zones at the moment. You know, this is what came out of Generic just over a week ago. And I don't know if any of you have got experience of zonal planning, but I have in France. And, you know, that to me is very out of date and has generated disasters, including particularly retail disasters. And the high street ended in France many years ago. And you know, that's combined with the proposed expansion of permitted development rights, which is also frightening, given that we are now living with a massive stock of homes that are unhealthy and not decent living standards. So, you know, and really spatial planning starts off with housing element rather than connectivity. So I think sort of getting that balance right about where you put things and not just relying on site allocations is certainly something that should be supported, but equally we need to be giving more powers to local authorities to combine spaces in a different way. And that means addressing the whole issue about compulsory purchase and compensation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think it kind of really reflects what Roger is saying. And I think what we are putting forward is something where we are starting off with not with the land use, i.e. employment over there, town centre, a bit of mixed use over there, a bit of resi over there, but actually let's start off with the urban form, kind of create the spaces and the buildings that we need, and these spaces and buildings being flexible enough so land uses can change over time, and we can go also back to that finer grain of land uses, which we all, I think, kind of appreciate and love in our centres, in our local high streets, which used to include workshops and working and shopping, everything really. But over the last centuries, we have pulled everything apart. And I think it's time to bring it back together and focus on our built environment and the spaces and the buildings, and then put the uses that we need within them.